In everybody's life, there's a special person.
The most famous goodbye in the history of popular music started as a real goodbye to a real person in a room in Nashville, before Whitney Houston, before the 14 weeks at #1, before it became the song played at 1,000 funerals. "I Will Always Love You" was one woman's way of telling a man she was leaving him, not as a lover, but as a partner she had outgrown. That detail is the key to a question most people never think to ask. The world knew Dolly Parton. Her face, her laugh, her rhinestones, her wit. She wrote more than 3,000 songs, sold north of 100 million records, and spent more than 60 years singing about love in every shade it comes in. But who did she love? Not the caricature, the woman underneath it. She never really kept it a secret. Across a lifetime of interviews, songs, and eulogies, she told us again and again which people had marked her, who she owed, who she fought with, who she grieved. Put those statements side by side, and 5 names rise above the rest. 5 relationships, each a completely different kind of love. There is the uncle who believed in a barefoot girl before anyone else did. The mentor who made her a star and then took her to court. The 2 women who became her sisters in harmony. The best friend she sang with for 40 years. And a singer she barely knew in person, yet was bound to more deeply than almost anyone. It begins in the Smoky Mountains with a man, a child, and a cheap guitar. Long before Nashville, there was Uncle Billy. Bill Owens was Avie Lee Parton's younger brother, a songwriter and guitar player working the East Tennessee country circuit, and he heard something in his niece that the rest of a very poor, very crowded household was too busy surviving to notice. She was one of 12 children. He decided she was going to be a star. The belief came with action. When she was 8, by several accounts, he bought her a proper child-sized Martin guitar to replace the crude thing she'd fashioned from an old mandolin and 2 salvaged strings. When she was 10, he drove her to Knoxville and got her onto C.A. Walker's radio and television show, her first real audience. He pushed her to practice. He hauled her to local performances, often at hours a child had no business being awake. And crucially, he wrote with her. Their first song together, Puppy Love, was penned when she was 11 and recorded in 1959, when she was 13, her very first single. What makes the relationship more than sentimental is that it actually worked as a partnership. In 1966, a song the 2 of them wrote, "Put It Off Until Tomorrow," became a top 10 hit for Bill Phillips and was named BMI Song of the Year. Listen closely to that record, and there's a young, uncredited harmony voice floating behind Phillips, Dolly herself. That songwriting credit, more than any performance, is what got Nashville's attention and cracked the door open. The 2 of them signed to the same publisher, Fred Foster's Combine Music, and made the long drives between the mountains and Music Row together, writing as they went. It was Foster who would soon sign Dolly on her own and hand her a real record deal. Owens backed her on guitar in those lean early years, and the pair kept hitting. "The Company You Keep," another song they wrote, became a second chart record for Bill Phillips. Decades later, Uncle Billy was still turning up at Dollywood with a red electric guitar, playing in the family show. When Owens died in 2021, Parton wrote a long eulogy for the man she still called Uncle Billy. The line that mattered most was the simplest. "I wouldn't be here if he hadn't been there," she wrote. She admitted she could never fully calculate the debt. It's really hard to say or to know for sure what all you owe somebody for your success. But she knew its size. What Uncle Billy gave her wasn't a technique or a connection. It was the earliest, riskiest thing anyone can give a child, the assumption that she was worth betting on. That belief carried her to Nashville. What she found there was a bigger stage, a bigger name, and a relationship that would nearly break her. In 1967, a 21-year-old Dolly Parton walked onto the most-watched syndicated country show in the country. Porter Wagoner, sequined, silver pompattered, already a Grand Ole Opry star, had an opening in his cast, and he handed it to her. He did not discover her. She'd already scored a minor hit with Dumb Blonde, but he gave her a national audience every single week, and for that she was, and remained, grateful. Gratitude, though, is not the whole story. On stage, they were golden, racking up duet awards and back-to-back hits. Off stage, the relationship curdled as she grew. He was the boss, the producer, the man whose name was on the marquee, and he did not enjoy watching his protégé outgrow the frame he'd built for her. She would later, in a moment of candor, call him a male chauvinist pig. The partnership that made her was becoming a cage. By 1974, she knew she had to leave. Telling him was another matter. Every conversation turned into an argument, so she did the only thing she truly knew how to do. She went home, wrote her feelings into a song, and came back and sang it to him across his desk. It was called I Will Always Love You. According to the story both told for years, Wagner sat listening, and this hard, proud man was moved. He called it the prettiest song he'd ever heard, and agreed to let her go, on the condition that he produce it. The piece didn't hold. A few years later, Wagner sued her for around $3 million, claiming he'd made her and was owed a share of her career for life. It became known as one of country music's ugliest feuds, tangled up in tabloid rumors of an affair that both denied. She settled out of court, reportedly paying about $1 million over time, and made her peace with the price. I made up my mind that if he could live with it, I could live without it, she said. Here is where a lesser story would end, with a bitter split. Theirs didn't. Over the years, the two circled back toward each other. He apologized. She forgave. Writing about it later, she refused to flatten it into villain and victim. So I forgave him, and I asked him to forgive me. I'm sure I was a pain in the ass to him. In May 2007, she stood beside him at the Opry for his 50th anniversary as a member and sang I Will Always Love You to him one last time, the song now meaning exactly what its title said. He called her one of his best friends. 5 months later, he was dying of lung cancer, and she was at his bedside 2 hours before the end. At his funeral, she led the choir. The song she wrote to escape him would go on to travel further than either of them could have dreamed. But its next chapter would run through two women who saw Dolly not as a boss or a protégé, but as an equal. The idea was almost too good to survive its own scheduling. Emmylou Harris and Linda Ronstadt had been close friends and harmony partners for years, two of the most admired voices in American music, and they shared a not-so-secret obsession. As the story goes, when the two of them first compared notes on their favorite female singer, they gave the same one-word answer, Dolly. Dwayne, 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 Dewey. The admiration ran both ways, which is rarer than it sounds among stars of that size. Harris had already recorded Parton's Coat of Many Colors. Ronstadt had the commercial muscle of a rock phenomenon, and Parton was the mountain-bred songwriter whose phrasing they'd both studied. The spark, by Ronstadt's telling, was almost comic in its urgency. Harris phoned her one day with the news that Dolly Parton was sitting in her living room and she had to come over, now. Ronstadt, 40 minutes away, made it in 20. When they finally got into a room and sang together, Parton leading an old Carter family tune while the other two rapped harmonies around her, something happened that none of them ever quite got over. When we heard our voices, Parton remembered, it was like injecting some kind of serum into your veins. Turning that high into a record took the better part of a decade. 3 of the biggest careers in music pulled in 3 directions. The logistics were a nightmare, and the personalities did not always align. It was 1987 before the first trio album finally arrived, and when it did, it sold over 1 million copies, won a Grammy, and stood as proof that 3 headliners could dissolve their egos into a single blend. A second volume, recorded in 1994, sat on a shelf for 5 years amid the same scheduling and creative tensions before it saw release in 1999. Those frictions are part of the truth, and Parton never pretended otherwise, but they never touched the core of it. This was a different love than the ones that shaped her early life, not a mentor lifting her up or a boss holding her down, but a bond between equals who had nothing to prove to one another. Of everything she recorded across 60 years, the trio work was what she reached for when she talked about pride. I love these girls like sisters, she said, adding that what the 3 of them made together would stand up long after we're all gone. Would sisterhood is one kind of forever. But the friendship that defined the rest of her life belonged to a gambler with a gray beard and a voice like warm gravel. No duet partner ever fit her like Kenny Rogers. By the early 1980s, he was already a crossover titan in his own right, the gravel-voiced storyteller behind The Gambler and Lady, when the Bee Gees handed the two of them a song called Islands in the Stream in 1983. It went to #1 on both the country and pop charts, a crossover so complete it stopped sounding like a record and started sounding like a fact of nature. But the hit was almost beside the point. What formed around it was a friendship of nearly 4 decades that both of them treated as one of the great gifts of their lives. They kept finding reasons to sing together. Real Love, a tender cover of Bob Seger's We've Got Tonight, and decades on, a song whose title read like a mission statement, You Can't Make Old Friends. That last one is almost unbearable to hear now. Two aging legends singing plainly about the fear of losing each other. When Rogers staged his farewell to the stage, it was Parton he wanted beside him for the goodbye. He died in March 2020, at 81. Her tribute, filmed through obvious tears, cut straight to the bone. You never know how much you love somebody until they're gone. She made a point of separating the man from the myth. Above all the music and the success, she said. She had loved him as a friend, and then she reached, as she so often did, for the 4 words that followed her through life, telling him she would always love him. Later that year, she sang for him again at a televised memorial, and in 2023, a lost duet the two had recorded surfaced on his posthumous album, One More Harmony from Beyond the Grave. The friendship has a final, almost unbearable footnote. Dolly Parton's last public post, shared just 10 days before her own death in August 2026, was not a grand statement or a farewell. It was a clip of her and Kenny in their glittering prime, singing Islands in the Stream, with a simple caption marking 43 years of the song. Of all the images she could have left the world on, she chose one of herself beside her old friend, mid-harmony. When the news of her passing broke, Roger's own family answered it, writing to her directly, they would always love her too. 4 words kept surfacing across every one of these relationships, written for a mentor, sung to a best friend, and, most famously of all, carried around the world by a woman Dolly Parton hardly knew. The strangest and largest love on this list was built almost entirely out of a single song. Dolly Parton and Whitney Houston were never close friends. They moved in different worlds. What connected them was 3.5 minutes of music that started in Porter Wagoner's office and ended up belonging to everyone. The path there ran through a decision that reveals how much Parton understood her own worth. Years before Houston, Elvis Presley wanted to record I Will Always Love You, a dream for any songwriter, but the deal required her to sign over half the publishing. She adored Elvis and it broke her heart, but she said no, she would keep her song. That refusal looked stubborn at the time. It looked like genius in 1992, when Houston's version, recorded for The Bodyguard, exploded across the planet, 14 weeks at #1, a soundtrack that moved tens of millions of copies, and every play sent its royalties home to the woman who wrote it. Parton's discovery of that version has become one of her most beloved stories, because of how ordinary it was. Driving her car, half listening to the radio, she caught an unfamiliar a cappella voice, the naked, unaccompanied opening that Kevin Costner had fought for and producer David Foster had shaped, and didn't recognize the song at first, until Houston hit the chorus. I just about wrecked the car, she said. The sheer scale of what Houston did left her stunned and grateful. She felt, she admitted, like she had finally arrived as a writer. 2 decades earlier, she'd sung it to say goodbye to Porter. Now it was a global anthem, and she made sure the world knew who had made it soar. Houston, she always said, was the one who took it worldwide. In 1994, it was Parton herself who handed Houston the Grammy the song had earned. Then, in 2012, the connection turned to grief. When Houston died young, Parton's statement was raw and immediate. Mine is only one of the millions of hearts broken, she said, before signing off with the only words that fit, Whitney, I will always love you. Hearing that recording again, played under those circumstances, undid her. It pierced her like a knife, she said, to think that her words, her feeling, were now tied forever to something so final. She could not have known how completely that sentence would come back around. Look at the 5 together, and a portrait forms that no magazine cover ever quite captured. A girl who let an uncle's faith become the foundation of a life. A woman who could be sued by her mentor and still lead the choir at his funeral. A star secure enough to disappear into a 3-part harmony. a friend who kept singing with the same man for 40 years, and a songwriter humble enough to hand her greatest song to another voice and call it a gift.
Manda with old Nick.
The common thread isn't fame. Not one of these people made this list because of a chart position. They made it because of loyalty, gratitude, forgiveness, and a stubborn refusal to let success turn her cold. Dolly Parton remembered who was in the room before she was famous, and she kept them close after. What these 5 relationships reveal is a woman who valued the people far more than the applause, who understood, long before most, that a career becomes history but the people become part of who you are. And then there is the song. She wrote "I Will Always Love You" to say goodbye to Porter Wagoner. She sang it to say goodbye to Kenny Rogers. She used those same 4 words to close the message she wrote when her husband died. Whitney Houston turned it into the sound of grief and love for an entire world. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being a breakup song and became the truest thing Dolly Parton ever said out loud, a promise she made over and over to everyone she loved. When she passed away on August 25, 2026, at 80, the world reached instinctively for that song and turned it back toward her. The goodbye she wrote for someone else half a century ago had quietly been waiting to become her own. Dolly, we will always love you.